So I'm going to get us started. I'd like to welcome everybody today. Today is actually the launch of our Spring 22 edition of the Cornerstone Speaker Series, hosted by Cleveland State University's Mattel College of Business. My name is Kenneth Kahn, and I have the privilege of serving as Dean of the Mattel College of Business. We started the speaker series in conjunction with our new strategic vision, which is to be the business cornerstone for Northeast Ohio and beyond. And striving to achieve this vision, this event exemplifies our commitment for foundational community engagement. Today, we specifically delve into the topic of supply chain uncertainty. And I greatly appreciate, we have two speakers joining us today. I appreciate their time. They're going to be introduced in a minute, but first, it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Dr. Chen, who is one of our esteemed faculty in our Department of Operations and Supply Chain Management. Dr. Chen teaches business analytics and international operations coursework, and his research examines the interface of marketing and operations management with a focus on pricing and profit optimization, inventory management, sustainability, and application of advanced technologies. With that, Dr. Chen, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Ken. Yeah, it's our pleasure actually to have like two distinct speakers representing two very critical industry for us today. So I'll first start with a brief agenda for today, and then do the introduction of our two speakers, and then they're going to continue with their prepared talk. So then after that, what we'll do is a couple of facilitated questions, sessions that's prepared by me, and then ending up with some Q&As from our audience. So that's a brief agenda. As for the speakers, we have Steve Downey from Cleveland Clinic. Steve Downey is the Chief Supply Chains and Patient Support Services Officer for the Cleveland Clinic. He's a healthcare expert with a passion for helping the industry treat and serve patients better. His experiences includes organizations across the healthcare spectrum, including medical devices, services, GPOs, and health systems. He's also a recognized supply chain expert, an in-demand speaker, and well-published author on the subject. He currently serves as co-chair of the Children's Brain Tumor Foundation, and is also a board member and president of Friends Health Connection. As for our second speaker, Mr. Locke Valentine, he is the Vice President of Sales, Inventory, and Operations Planning for Mattel. He's a consumer packaged goods industry expert with extensive experiences from both Lego and Mattel. The two most successful toy manufacturers. His experience includes forecasting, planning, analytics, and performance management. Mr. Valentine has published research in the field of forecasting accuracy and performance measurements, and is an international speaker too. All right, so before I have Steve and the next speaker talk about the challenges stuff they face in the specific industry, let me just share with some brief reality checks for the supply chain disruptions and uncertainty right now. So with that, I'm going to share with the screen really quick. And let's see. Okay, so I guess you guys can see it fine here. Not sure whether everyone's has this experience, but currently and it has been 2 years basically, especially at the very first beginning. What typically people tend to do is more like a wake up more. If you're not real plans, which really the pandemics and also the increasing uncertainty keep us unguarded. So the wake up more being seen in many places. I have three articles actually quoted on different CEOs commenting upon how supply chain disruptions has caught us off guard. The second thing is, why we care about supply chain this more is it becomes more and more consumer-facing functions in nowadays. So this is where like the mainstream media's attention pretty much on a daily basis. So that's for one. And finally, for the uncertainty, what I've been asked from many is that where can we wait it out? But the truth is, as I'm going to share with you on the next page, where when I was preparing this, Omicron just came up. So it is a kind of never-ending things coming forward. This is what in 2021 from McKinsey, they did a study and then to kind of trace how much uncertainty disruption have been happening over the decades. And what you can see is that maybe we're just like last year being hit big upon the pandemic. But what you're seeing is the increasing trends, from all aspects you look at. It's become more uncertain, become more risky managing supply chain. So, and then bottom line is that how does that imply? What McKinsey concludes is that over the decade time, there's probably more like a big shocks here and there. It's like in a 10-year spectrum, you can expect about like 40 something impact on your bottom line, and then the spread it out, that's the easy 4% impacts on business. So this is a timely, is still a very important topic for now. And with that, I think our two experts today is going to give us some deep insight looks into the challenges that we face and what are the best practices we have. So without further ado, let me start sharing my screens and let Steve talk about what he has seen in the industry. And welcome, Steve.
Thank you, Dr. Chen. And whack-a-mole is a great way to describe it. It is like every day you don't know what's going to happen and another mole pops up, and we run around trying to solve those problems, and it just distracts you from the problem you were trying to solve yesterday. I'll tell you a story about how it impacts a healthcare organization from what I saw in real life example. So imagine a case where all the supplies are stored in patient floors, right, in the dispensing units on the floors. And there's a health system had 160 different dispensing locations across all the different hospitals. And as working through back orders, an item goes on to back order for whatever reason. And there's plenty of that happening at the moment. When that happens, the warehouse, now all the backup product investigation had to happen. Do we have an approved substitute that the clinical teams say is capable to be used? Hopefully you've already got that, but if not, there's a scramble to get that approved. How do we make sure patient care isn't affected? Then once that's approved, all the ordering happens, and then it has to come into the warehouse. And in this case, the pallet heights were different. So it backed up into the aisles, and then it needed to move up into these 160 locations. But in many health systems, they use weighted bins, and a weighted bin system has to be calibrated for a particular item. Otherwise, all your measurements are wrong. So you have to go bin by bin and say, this bin is now alternate product X with this weight. So by the time you're doing that, you can't put the product in the bin. And so it has to sit in another location with a manual label, which then backs up the supply into the corridor, which backs up the supply into the warehouse. So none of which you're supposed to do, which then means you're running bin to bin to try to recalibrate in 160 locations as quick as you can to get this supply there. And it takes weeks. And by the time this one health system got done doing that effort for this one SKU in those weeks, then the product came off of back order and the other product came back in. And now they have to go back and do it all over again to get the other product because that's what's more clinically preferred. And you see what I mean by whack-a-mole, right? It's backed up the entire care process, the entire supply chain to do this. And their staff who are just trying to solve this problem over and over and over again. And frankly, it's become almost run of the mill. And my mission is to say this is not run of the mill. We have to do better. There are right now 42 different categories that are on shortages, and big categories like blood management or water. There's 300, I think last count, 368 individual items on some stage of back orders or substitutions or shortages. Anywhere things containing resin from what happened in the resin fires to medical gases. Some of it's demand related to COVID. Some of it is supply problems in supply chains of the manufacturing. Some of it's transportation issues. There's 100 different reasons. There are 100 plus ships offshore right now. And I think today was 103 or something. But the amount of those containers that carry medical products is significant. And if you don't want to be stuck in that, you pay for the air freight to get it bypassed through that. And how much of that handling between where it's being supplied and getting to me is going to be affected by Omicron. And so that wave is hitting everywhere. The problems are not going away. It only continues. In fact, it seems to be getting worse. Another example, we get a significant amount of supplies internationally, and as Omicron surges globally, we then think about, well, what's the vaccination levels of those countries? What vaccine variant did they use, and how resistant to Omicron is that variant? And what will impact that have on our supplies? And therefore, do we expect supply shortages in other areas to continue? There's provinces that are under human rights constraints, and therefore we can't get major supply areas from, we have to work on backups. So it's a continual effort from clinicians and supply chain teams to try to solve it.
Thank you, Steve. Yeah, so next, we welcome Logs. And Log is the expert in forecasting and analytics. And you're going to share his insights with us on the global supply chain uncertainty.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chen. Hey, and just listening to Steve's situation, I think there's a lot of similarity here. Very different industries, and I have to say that in the industry you're in, I have the greatest respect for, especially during these times. The toy industry is very different. It's not exactly human lives that are at stake, but we like to sort of think that we can make a difference in human lives, regardless of that. In that sense, I just want to say a lot of similarities. Whack-a-mole. Thank you, Dr. Chen, for choosing a toy as a metaphor here. And I think it's a really well-positioned metaphor for this. What I'm just going to talk about today is sort of how I sort of see the situation and what's really important in situations of great uncertainty and disruptions. So let me just get my screen here on here. So a little bit about myself at first. I just want to say, so yeah, I'm at Mattel currently. Previously, I were working for PepsiCo, and I've been working as well for a number of years for Lego, another toy company, as was mentioned in the beginning. So I'm sort of trying to draw upon several different types of experiences here and combining them in perhaps some advice that makes sense for other listeners here, but also something that seems just for me to be the patterns. And it's interesting because I don't really see that many really new patterns, forming in the current situation. I see a lot of classical patterns, and I'll get back to that in a minute. I've lived and worked across many different countries, and when the pandemic, started, as an example, I were in Switzerland. So I lived in Switzerland, just north of Italy, which sort of, became a really early sort of, triggering point, especially in Europe, for quite a lot of things. And I saw an unraveling, if you will, of the supply chain that is very, very vast for a company the magnitude and size of PepsiCo, which was the company I was with then. Moving into the toy, or back into the toy industry again, into Mattel, there is quite a lot of similarities. Because it's just consumer packaged goods, but there's also quite a lot of differences. Food and beverages are disrupted in a different way than toys are disrupted in what we have experienced in the last few years. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. But just wanted to say something around Mattel. I hope you all have an idea of what Mattel is. After all, it's a very famous American toy company that hopefully brings childhood memories to life for everyone. And it's an interesting story because the last couple of years have not necessarily been positive. In terms of we have had constant business success. We've had a turnaround situation going on, and that is fortunately now behind us, and we are in a very mature and good state as a company. But the last couple of years have been full of disruptions, tons of disruptions that had nothing to do with, if you will, a COVID pandemic and other things that are sort of more external. So companies, what I just want to say, companies go through disruptions, uncertainties all the time, regardless of what's happening across the world. And I think that's one sort of key sort of premise for everything. Embrace it, live it, take it on, because if you don't, you're just not able to manage the business, right? That's really, really simple. And Mattel, as this example, have been doing this since 1945. And many companies have decades and decades of experiences that might be relevant when uncertainty increases, etc. I have 3 stories just to sort of reflect on a little bit here. I know this is Brexit. When you hear Brexit, I'm sure you've heard the term before, but of course you had the luxury of sort of looking at the Europeans thinking, okay, so that's going on over there. Maybe some of this has had some kind of implications on you guys. Maybe you felt it somewhat. But I'll let you know that sort of living in Europe when this is happening, and when Brexit came down to the vote in terms of the referendum, I was living in London at the time, so I experienced that situation really up close. It's really interesting. It took a couple of years for things to be sorted out. And when you talk about uncertainty, that's one of the interesting things that you learn here. When things happen, that creates wildly different types of outcomes of the future. The uncertainty of what can happen. Of course, you start speculating, will this happen? Will that happen? Will that third thing happen? Or that 10th thing happen? Information or your judgment about what's most likely is critically important there. And in the situation of Brexit, it really came down to the wire, in the sense of it really wasn't until the very last minute that we fully understood, or sort of understood to a large extent the true implications of what Brexit would do on a business. And one of the lessons learned here is supply network design, which is not a new discipline at all, but supply network design all of a sudden really became critically important. Understanding, so where is the supply network actually? Just understanding all the nodes in it can be difficult if you're a certain magnitude, but actually then figuring out what's the optimal configuration here. And that depends on so many things. Could be tariffs, it can be all kinds of business rules, conditions, setups, right? There's so many factors that goes into it. And supply network design is just a classical discipline in supply chain management that I just want to sort of say that really was incredibly important. And I think it continues to be important as uncertainties continue to exist in the world today. So I wanted to underline that. And then the unprecedented lockdowns that we all experienced, and I experienced it starting in Europe and then in the States afterwards. It's incredibly how difficult all of a sudden stuff are that you take somewhat for granted. It started as a supply uncertainty situation. It moved into a demand uncertainty situation. And then it ended up again as a supply uncertainty situation. And of course, it's always uncertain with demand. So, I mean, it's really sort of, switching back and forth between that supply and demand side. And it's incredible how agile that you need to be. And there's quite a lot of things that you will have read about in the news or felt on your own companies, like global chip shortages that certainly persist to this day. The shipping rates, the container availabilities, all that stuff, as was also spoken about in the previous session, it all comes down to being really good at demand forecasting, and planning is actually really, really, really important. And the COVID-19 lockdowns really underlined that to me. And you could say that there had been a level of complacency. Hey, we have a run rate of demand. I sort of know what to expect. Hey, I'm pretty sure that supply will be there because it's always there. Yeah, but what if it isn't, right? What will then be the implication on the consumers, on customers? What will they do different? and incorporating some of these sort of things in planning processes becomes the single most important thing that you can do, right? Because it makes you ready, more ready than you would otherwise have been. And in the case of Mattel, we have a company here with 5,000 toys globally. That amount of toys, sourced across several factories across the world, many factories across the world. There's a lot of things that can go wrong. So having adequate scenarios about the future, forecasts, replanning, always keeping up to date with latest assumptions, speaking about the assumptions all the time is so important. I also wanted to say that logistics has been making huge headlines last year. I've never seen logistics this fashionable almost. It's quite amazing. Everyone, seems to be an expert about shipping lanes and containers and so on and so forth. Just go back a few years, there was not that much focus on it, because it was fairly stable. Yes, there was a little variability, but nothing to the magnitude of what we're seeing today. For me, it really starts at, if you think back, if you remember the Ever Given ship, in the Suez Canal, that's where it triggered the whole thing in my mind. That's where it sort of elevated its importance for me. But labor shortages, which is really what is triggering a lot of the problems we have today, in my view, that's actually something that is not new at all. And it's something that we always discussed, right? What if we run out of labor for, a certain region of the world, and maybe this is, Los Angeles and Long Beach that we have run out of labor, momentarily. And the implications of that, it doesn't have to be in Malaysia or in Taiwan or some place very far from here. It's a real problem, and it can be a real problem anywhere in the world, really. And so it's really interesting to think about the capabilities that you really need in that situation. And to me, it really comes down to inventory management capabilities. Good old-fashioned basic safety stock setting, stuff like that, really understanding how to do that well becomes incredibly important. And I just want to end here with, there's a couple of things that I would say that the last 3 years have really sort of learned me. This is CPG today. Supply chain planning, management has only grown in importance. And I think you would sort of infer that just by counting the number of news articles that being written just in the popular press about these topics, over the time of common disruptions that we experienced with COVID. But what does that mean? One of the things it really means to me is that demand planning, very specifically planning demand, needs a lot more sophistication than it may have today, because there's a lot of shortfalls. And Dr. Chen, some of your research areas, I think, is quite relevant, because how do you actually, in a demand planning process that typically is associated very much of a practice of supply chain, how do you take into consideration elements that are normally buried in marketing departments, insights functions, etc. What is the price elasticity of a particular product? What's the implication if the price goes up because of raw materials goes up? What will this actually give you as a result? Will demand go up and down? Well, could be, it doesn't. It also depends on what your competitors are doing. So you can't really just look at your own company. You all the time have to look at the environment that you're in. And I just want to say we're still, in my view, at the very early days of really good demand planning. And it has to evolve from here. And I think it's come a long way over the last 4 decades approximately, but it has a long way to go, in my view. Sales and operations planning, integrated business planning. To me, this is just completely now cemented as a necessity. The famous sort of premise for S&OP is you balance demand and supply. Well, when demand and supply is constantly pushed out of balance to each other, obviously one of the most important things for a company will be to find that balance, such that you don't waste all your resources or you disappoint your customers completely. And so there's been a period of time, since the, I think, 70s truly, where you have had this sort of notion that it may be a good thing to have an S&OP process or integrated business planning. And so you sort of incorporate some focus on it. But this is now gone. I think the level of uncertainty that Dr. Chen showed, in his presentation as well, just shows demand supply imbalance will happen every single quarter. Your focus will be to find the balance again. The S&OP process was built for that purpose. And so therefore that's truly important. And it doesn't matter what configuration and shape and form it is in, but finding demand supply balance, of course, is the most important thing a company almost can do, that, in order to reach their ambitions and visions, for sure. The last one I want to mention might be somewhat controversial, but I want to say what the last couple of years has taught me is that, the machine learning AI focus that has been the situation of the last 5-10 years, perhaps actually, this is really now normalizing. And I think that's a really good thing. It is incredibly useful to leverage machine learning, techniques, approaches, technologies, and they are more accessible than ever. It's everywhere. Every single where you look, there is machine learning or AI doing something, right? In the CPG industry, it's just important to understand that that's not the end in mind. Don't create projects just because you want to do some kind of vanity, ambition project with regards to AI and ML. Do it because there's a purpose for it, and there's a lot of purpose for it. In fact, it turns out that machine learning and AI and stuff like that, analytics, is actually fulfilling, like decades of promises from the sort of lean movement, if you will. That is, fairly sort of dated in many ways. Not saying any negative about it. It's just been around for a very long time. It's been a lot of talk about removing non-value-added work, and I think that promise is now actually being, fulfilled with machine learning and AI, because it's all about taking something that's really sort of, transactional and automating it in a way. And this is about normalizing machine learning and AI for me. And that's one of the interesting things. It wasn't machine learning and AI that saved the day for everyone. It was the classical disciplines, understanding how do you actually manage your safety stocks? How do you actually ensure that you regain a balance of demand and supply when it's out of whack? How do you figure out what the implication of inflation is on your demand? It's not just a technical thing for your budgets. It has real impact for products and services that you sell. I would imagine everywhere, including the healthcare industry. And so it's incredibly important, I think, to listen to let's call them classical disciplines that have been taught and focused on, year in and year out in universities like this one. It's important to focus on those classics, because from these classics, the tools, the mechanisms for dealing with uncertainty and disruptions, they actually exist. And universities are let's call it an unbiased source. We can trust what's being told us. We can really understand what's being said, because it's not a selling conversation. It's not, I want to sell you this amount of new product and service. It's actually advice for the sake of giving advice, right? And gaining innovation and gaining progress. So just want to say that in the end, really focus on the classics, because that's the one thing that will really make a difference in uncertainty and disruption, if you ask me, at least. This is my opinion. That's it.
Okay. Thanks. Yeah, Lars. Yeah, for give like pretty insightful. Yeah, and actually answer some of the questions. Yeah, touch up on lightly. Just to as a reminder, things. Yeah, Lars touched about like machine learning and AI. Our next Cornerstone speaker series actually going to touch upon that on March 10th. AI and machine learnings, in the business world. So stay tuned with that for the communications. But yeah, I mean, I'd like to come back, and then pose a couple questions, later on, from the audience too. But one thing I think Steve's, brought up pretty interesting stories about, the wake up more situations. And then again, this is the same industry constantly getting hit by not just the supply, the demand side as well. So would you be able to share with us some of the best practice, short-term wise, how to mitigate, something like kind of existing we're living up with, and also like long-term, what are you looking into, like kind of better control, manage the risk? Because if this is something going to keep happening, in the long term, what do you think that's can be better managed?
Great question. There's a few things short term and a number of things long term. Short term, there's a group of health systems who are trying to brainstorm this together. There's the Healthcare Industry Resiliency Collaborative, or HERC, where we're sharing best practices across each other, because I think as an industry, and by the way, that's not just health systems, it's distributors and suppliers and everybody, just to try to work at the problem overall. What can we do better? I have a focus here for the supply chain at the clinic that we will be efficient, modern, agile, global, and resilient. And in the last one there is resilient. If I dive specifically into how will we be resilient, first I have to narrow my code base. I have 150 plus thousand SKUs in my database. And to try to really bring the level of resiliency I can't do it on 150,000 items. So which ones are the really critical items that affect patient care, perhaps don't have backups or substitutes, perhaps are used in really high volumes. So triaging what are those real critical items. For those critical items, understanding, do we have substitutes wherever possible? And then also, where are they stored and if possible, getting even down to raw material source. The great example is the resin that was in Sharps containers. And little known fact that most of the nation's Sharps containers had come from one resin factory, that when you lost your resin factory, it affected everybody's Sharps containers. So understanding the key points in your supply chain and having the address level impact for that. Then implementing monitoring systems and peer conversations like HERC, but a monitoring system that says, okay, I have a product made, let's say in Puerto Rico, and there's a hurricane coming to Puerto Rico. I know now specifically which codes I need to worry about. And what are my backups for those codes? What's my inventory levels? I can set stock levels based on the potential variability for those sites. But by having a monitoring service, I can tell what's happening and how might it affect if there's a product made in Mexico and there's a border crossing issue. Then we're looking at how do we better take down the wall between suppliers and health systems. This is a legacy in our industry that, frankly, I don't think should exist. And I've lived on all sides of this. There is not a lot of collaborative effort between sharing inventory levels, communicating across supply and demand needs, showing where shortages are and responding to them. And I think it's crazy to say, I expect you to have product on my shelf at all times, and I don't give you visibility to what that shelf quantity is. And so how do we get better communication to take down that, whether that's with technology or some improved systems or just access? And then how do we communicate? You can imagine if I have to change anything or there's a world event that's happening, we get lots of questions. So what happens in this case? Clinicians start calling suppliers or start calling supply chain or calling their friends. We need to be ahead of all that. But when it does happen, we need clear communication from the supply community, and we're all really tight in what we're saying together about how it's being solved. So if you follow that continuum, really in the end, what that means is prioritization and better collaboration. It's implementing better demand planning. It's implementing across the spectrum. What can healthcare do better to visibility? And other industries have done this. So that's the other point, is we should learn. And oftentimes healthcare says we're different and we have to do it our own way. That's great. And there are certain things we do very particularly, but we can also learn how to do better. I'm pushing as hard as I can to find what are all those better ways. And discussions like this are great because you can lead me to those better ways.
Thank you. Yeah, I heard you, clearly that, prioritizations, especially during this time, everything got shorted, basically. That's one of the quotes I heard is like, the only thing we are not short of is the shortage. Yeah, so that's,
Right.
So really prioritizing, utilize your best either human resources or assets to the most critical places that you want it to be. And the other thing is collaboration as well, which actually go along with the visibility and the transparency along the roads. And Locke, do you have anything that you'd like to add on, like short-term and long-term better ways to like mitigates and controls or manage risk?
Yes. I'll add a few perspectives. I just want to sort of say Steve's response here, I wholeheartedly subscribe to. So I think that was a really well capture of what to do, what best practices. One specific angle that I would like to maybe then speak about. This is a topic that I have worked very intensively with over several decades is demand planning and forecasting. So of course that becomes incredibly difficult. And it's really hard to talk about what is best practice in demand planning. It becomes really philosophical debate really quickly. But there's a couple of things that I'd like to sort of share. There's been a debate, I think, going on for some while, if you're at least in the dusty corners of, discussing the inner workings of demand planning, is demand planning something that needs to focus on constrained demand, or should it focus on unconstrained demand? And what is this? Well, it is exactly the situation of, do you plan with a particular supply constraint in mind, or do you base your demand plans off your ideal prediction of what you believe could sort of be demand in a marketplace? And it sounds like a small philosophical debate, and I imagine across university campuses, students discussing this to the long hours, and so on, as I did when I was in university. But here's the situation: I don't think unconstrained demand exists really. I think that's a fata morgana. To me, the last couple of decades, and especially the last couple of years, has just taught me one simple situation, which is demand planning is planning demand in the situation that you're in, regardless of how many constraints you have to deal with. So you have to take it into consideration. You can't just ignore it. And I think it's a good practice to also sort of look at, are you leaving something on the table, so to speak? What's the free potential, if you will, in the marketplace? And have an eye on that. But I really don't think it should, if you will, pollute demand planning, because it really distracts demand planning from its purpose, which is to give some early warning to a supply chain planning environment or ecosystem that allows the appropriate supply response to be given. And if the demand plan keeps sort of insisting on a supply response that's not feasible at all, or it can never actually happen, of course, that moves the point. That's a simple situation where this is black and white. But the reality is there's so many situations where it's a gray zone. Yeah, it may happen if we were okay with losing all of our margins. Then we could deliver to that demand, level of demand. Or it may happen if we were, if we were okay with just, let's say, ignoring that now is not the time to pounce in the market. Let's say it like this. So let's say that there's a bigger tactical strategic focus of it's the next year that you're ready to actually go after the next sort of level of demand and so on and so forth. So anyway, I digress a little bit here. The point is, make demand planning about the constrained situation of demand. That to me is really, really key. And that's an insight that when I think back to when I was a student at some point, I would have argued fiercely that, philosophically, let's start with the unconstrained in mind, but I'm no longer there.
Yeah, thank you, Lars. So yeah, we got about like 15 minutes left. Yeah, I think there are lots of questions started coming in. I myself have some, but I think I would start chiming in and then put up some of the common questions. I think people are eager to know, especially take away from the two experts here. So one thing, again, Lars talk about the classics, and one of the hallmarks of manufacturing system is just in time, the total production system. And people start questioning whether it's still relevant this day, because how can you still doing that? Let's probably start with Lars. What's your takes upon this? This long holds, just in time,
yes,
that have been popular for decades.
Yeah, that's a really good question. To me, it comes down to push and pull, right? And so if you have a production system like that, then you're doing your utmost to sort of ensure that you're in pull mode, right? So, if there is demand, in the marketplace, you act on it when it's there. You don't make huge bets into the future and so on. I would say the reality of many industries is that is not always, it's not always the same answer. So, and I'll use my example here from the toy industry. There's a period where pull exists, certainly exists, for sure. But there's also a period where it's a push situation. And I think we all know what happens around Christmas typically, right? The need to have inventory in place in physical retail locations or in fulfillment centers and so on is so great that type of inventory will have to be built over time. You can't just in time, if you will, ensure all that is there. So there's a climb of inventory at a certain point of time of the year, and there is an element of natural let's call it dynamic over that. You are no longer just in a pull mode. It's going to be a bit of a push. You are living with the bets that you're making as an industry almost, and that's the nature of it. And I think you can reduce it to a certain degree, but I don't think the nature of, for instance, this particular business I'm in toys, that you can truly do that. In food and beverage that I was in before, there's certain categories where you can really be in pull mode all the time, and I think just in time is just sort of a given. You don't even want to discuss it. It's obviously we are just in time as much as we entirely can be. However, there are periods of time, take a soft drink beverage, right? When all of a sudden summers get really, really warm, there's a lot of consumption of beverages and so on. Now, you can't really just wait to see the just-in-time forecast of temperatures, right? And then react on it, because again, you simply wouldn't be ready, through, hundreds and thousands of stocking points with your beverages, essentially. So you have to acknowledge that there's a certain point of time where it's about push. You have to push in order to make a bet, essentially. And the bet is there will be a lot of demand, and so you need to be ready for it. And so you can't really just sort of run classical, just-in-time principles all the way up in this supply chain. You have to decouple at some point. So that's a bit of a long-winded answer, perhaps, but I just want to say, don't just focus on that. That's not the answer to everything. The answer is usually given in the context, right? And therefore you push sometimes, and you pull sometimes.
Thank you, Lars. Yeah. Steve, you have anything to add on to the comments about just in time, the criticism?
Yeah, real quick, I guess I would add there's a number of balances just in time, and as well as balancing cost versus resiliency. So I think it's hard to make the just-in-time decision unless you have all the variables. If you know the supply ability of your suppliers or the supply risk, if I can factor in the risk, I can make a decision about inventory levels. If there's very minimal risk, I don't know, the warehouse is down the street from me here, manufacturing is done 2 cities over, and there's 7 manufacturing locations and they have tons of capacity, I'm fine with just-in-time. If there's only one national supplier and their raw material comes from a very geopolitically risky country, then I'm going to need to store more inventory. But I can't make that decision until I know the risk levels, until I know where everything is made, and I can score and assess that to decide how much inventory do I keep. And that's what caught healthcare, right? As we were thinking about PPE, not everybody knew where everything was made. And suddenly when things started happening and areas of the world started shutting down and then demand went through the roof, we all said, okay, we need to understand our chain, understand our risk, and started scrambling. It goes to the side then of how do you balance resiliency and cost? Should I pay more for a more resilient solution? Should I try to drive costs as low as absolutely possible? Again, it comes to balancing that. When you have an operational feedback mechanism that says this is a highly resilient product, focus on cost, or this is not so resilient, you might need to pay more or have more inventory to make sure you have, let's say, multiple suppliers of it.
Yeah, thank you. I got you. Yeah. I mean, I used to teach, in the intros, for operations and supply chain management. And it seems like, like kind of gory stuff that we can all try to get. But it's even for Toyota, after the 2011 tsunami, they realized that they need to keep some stocks for the long lead time supply chains, chip supply chains. So that's something they learned, and then I think they are better positions this time as compared with other automakers. So they give it kind of like some leeways to buy a little bit time, but it is just like so deep the problem now for the chip productions. So again, there will be some consideration as Steve is talking about efficiency and resilience, and our supply chains across multiple industry have been built in the last couple of decades, aiming for efficiency. And it's time like kind of people start talking about agility, resilience. So it's a good thing to like kind of like having this just-in-time JIT 2.0, assuming that's, Okay, the next questions, many audience they got is about like gets new information technology like blockchains, IoT. How would they come in and help? I think Locke touched upon a little bit of that. Actually, the very last of his talks, tools for prioritizing, identifying where to cut the waste. For example. I'd like to kind of go back to Steve. Having had a chance to talk about this IT information systems, AI, and so on. So what does the healthcare industries or clinic particularly do in this particular regard?
Yeah, so on the clinical side, a lot on that front, especially with AI and machine learning. On the supply chain side, I've implemented that sort of stuff in, let's say, data management, and to try to be robust in your SKUs and your SKU management as you try to manage large data sets. There's definitely a place for that. There is in demand sensing and resiliency as well. The other technologies you mentioned, blockchain still doesn't really found a home in healthcare. I think that's a technology we're looking to plug in rather than a use case that we've really identified for it. I think it will get there, but we're not there yet. The IoT is interesting because we now are trying to do things like track equipment where they are in the health system, and then what environment it's being stored in and where it's moving. So the better, because we're talking some pretty significant capital equipment that moves its way around health systems. And for example, if we're moving ventilators back and forth between Florida and Ohio as we were battling COVID, understanding what kind of shock those ventilators are going through in the transportation sides, and then having that in a control environment to be able to see what's happening in the equipment, where they are at all times. And so we're looking at those. We're also, number of health systems are looking at drone delivery, and how do you best leverage the package options that drones can bring you to kind of get that final mile. I think there's a lot of discussion about what's the intersection of technology and care as it goes to the home. And so as we start thinking about home monitoring devices, how does your watch and the blood pressure cuffs and the temperature sensors that we could get you at your home, how does that interface with the medical record system? And how does the medical record system interface with your physicians? What should you get device-wise pre and post incidents or surgeries? And then how does that tie into the supply chain side? Should I make sure you have X equipment? Or if you, let's say, physician on the telehealth says you need a medicine that I'm delivering by drone to drop that medicine off that afternoon. There's a lot of things I think we're going to go through as we kind of expand into that continuum of care and leverage technology and better supply chain to do that.
Thank you, Steve. No, anything to add on?
Yeah, I'll just add one thing. It's the speed of information, and when you think back over the last couple of years, that speed of information has increased for sure. Those technologies that you're mentioning here, they're either creating new information that we didn't have before, or they're increasing the speed of information of something that already was available but was really difficult to get to, or very slow to get to perhaps. And so I think there's a simple theme going through all these technologies, that it really allows us to understand something quicker. I'm talking about supply chain context here. Understand something quicker, understand the nature of a risk, flag the risk, earlier, quicker, then diagnose something, without biases necessarily. Typically you would let's call it, without data, you would ask, some kind of person that was very wise and experienced, and they would say, yeah, that feels like something I've seen before. I think you should do this, right? Now we can sort of treat everything like a small research, dilemma in a way. We can get some data on it. We can figure out, so what's the hypothesis, what's actually going on here. We can sort of be open to not necessarily having the answer up front, trying to find the answer and then reacting on it. But of course, the research projects are famous to take a long time. But in a business context, you want to know something for the next day meeting and so on and so forth. And I think some of these technologies here are allowing new information to be available that's necessary, but also the speed of that new information to come about such that you can really act really quickly. And so in a way, I think it's almost like the just-in-time conversation. That is perhaps, just-in-time 2.0, that the speed of information, is so fast that you can begin to react on more things, much closer to the timing of them happening. So it's a very different context than the Toyota manufacturing system. It's more the virtual world almost. But I just want to sort of give that as an example. I think the speed of information here is the important trend that I'm seeing in this.
Yep. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for adding that. So we're coming almost toward the end. Yeah. So one last thing, that I will ask you about is that is there one particular thing that you like our audience to take away from today's talk that we haven't touched upon? So maybe start with Steve. Yeah.
I'll go the clinic way and go beyond and give you two. Okay. The fact that it's not okay the way we are today, and we're working to change it. Resiliency is important in this industry, and it's also a two-way street. It's not just one side of any problem here. It's a two-way street. And second, I would say, I think the industry, ourselves and the industry, are open to doing this better. We're open to learning and innovating and trying to improve with new ways to really just, bring a fix to these kind of resiliency problems that we're seeing.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve. Love from your ends, but anything, you'd like to add on?
Yeah, I would say the key takeaway for me is this future is uncertain and disruptions are happening, right? So take that for granted. Always have 2 or 3 scenarios in your mind. Always, never ever think that you have worked it out, because of course you have not. And, it would be arrogant to sort of even contemplate and think that you have worked out your business. It won't be the situation. So always have 2 or 3 scenarios, and then, really monitor them and be open to that you have gotten it wrong and you might have to jump into another scenario. That's really the basic advice. This serves, I think, everyone well that uses this approach, thinking scenarios.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I mean, to conclude and then to edit, my own view upon this is to not just responsive, because you're basically acting like wake up more. That's what we begin with. Be proactive, and that's hopefully after the end of today's webinar, you pull a couple of tricks that you learned from today's 2 guest speakers that actually allowed you and do something much better than just wake up more, because this things is going to stay with us. I'm talking about uncertainty. I'm hoping that the virus things will be away. But again, that's what we do, and that's what the profession is for. We're born to deal with this, and I think this is the moment for it to shine. So thank you, gentlemen, and thank you for our audience to come in, and stay tuned for our next Cornerstone speaker series coming on March 10th about AI and machine learning.
Great discussion. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Long.
Thank you very much.